The cry for help. The fading light of the day hung over Larkin Park, casting long shadows across the path as the last remnants of sunlight slowly vanished. The sky was a canvas of deep blues and purples, blending into the darkening horizon. The park was quieting down now, the joyful shouts of children and the rhythmic thud of joggers' shoes gradually giving way to the tranquil stillness that would soon settle in for the evening. It was a moment of peace, almost serene. Yet there was an undercurrent, a feeling that something was amiss. Thomas sat on a worn wooden bench, his tired eyes scanning the park as he absent-mindedly rubbed his hand over his short-cropped gray beard. The faintest scent of pine mixed with the crisp autumn air, a smell that brought him back to his younger days in the woods. He had spent his fair share of time in forests and battlefields, but here, in the quiet park, it was just him and the loneliness that seemed to gnaw at his soul. He had left the military years ago, but the war within him, the war of memories and broken promises, seemed to never leave. The bench creaked beneath him as he shifted his weight, stretching his stiff legs. His mind wandered as he sat alone, just like he had so many times before. After serving in multiple conflicts across the world, Thomas had learned the art of solitude, of quietly observing the world around him without getting too attached. But tonight was different. There was something in the air, something that tugged at him from across the park. His eyes narrowed as they focused on a small figure sitting by herself near the play area. The girl was alone, which wasn't uncommon, but there was something unsettling about the way she sat there, her posture rigid and her hands moving in strange patterns. It was subtle, yet to Thomas, it was unmistakable. Her fingers were forming something, a shape, a signal. At first, he thought it was a game, a child lost in the world of make-believe. But then the pattern became clear, unmistakable. The girl was signaling. She was sending an SOS. Thomas felt a chill run through him. He stood up abruptly, his knees cracking with age, but the urgency in his movements belied his years. His military instincts kicked in instantly, recognizing the gesture for what it was. He had seen that sign before, in places where life and death were often decided in an instant. And SOS was no child's game. It was a cry for help. As his boots thudded against the pavement, he observed her more closely. The girl appeared to be no older than 10 or 11. Her small body was hunched slightly as she sat, her fingers moving through the air in quick, purposeful motions. She seemed oblivious to the other children playing nearby, their laughter and shouts ringing out in contrast to the tension surrounding her. Her face was pale, eyes wide, darting around as though searching for someone. But then her hands moved again, a clear and deliberate pattern. SOS. Help me, the sign seemed to whisper. Thomas's heart raced as he approached her cautiously, making sure not to startle her. He couldn't risk alarming her. He needed to understand why she was sending this signal. Why was she here, in the park, alone? And why had she chosen this moment, this place, to send such a desperate message? As he drew closer, the girl's movements stopped. Her hands, still raised in the air, trembled slightly as they hovered in place. She turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his heart skip a beat. In those brief seconds, it was as if time had frozen. Her gaze was filled with fear, deep, suffocating fear, and a silent plea for help that only those who had lived through the harshest realities could understand. The look was familiar to Thomas. He had seen it in the eyes of soldiers who had survived the worst of the battlefield, in the faces of refugees fleeing conflict, in the helpless stares of civilians caught in the crossfire. It was the face of someone who had been pushed to the edge of survival, someone who had no one else to turn to. "Are you okay?" Thomas asked softly, kneeling down in front of her. His voice was low and steady, but there was an urgency behind it that he couldn't disguise. For a moment, the girl said nothing. She didn't move, didn't even blink, as if she were unsure whether or not she could trust him. Then, slowly, her lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, she opened her mouth again and closed it, as though trying to form words but unable to do so. Her expression faltered as a tear slipped down her cheek, the silent evidence of a pain far deeper than anything Thomas could imagine. "Hey, it's okay," Thomas said gently, his voice a little firmer now. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to help." Her eyes widened slightly, as if considering his words, and then her hand slowly lowered. She looked down at her fingers, as though trying to decide if she should trust this stranger. The girl's small frame trembled slightly as the tension in her body began to ease, just a little. Thomas could tell that she was terrified. Her fear was palpable, practically radiating off her like a dark cloud. But her fear wasn't just for herself. It was the kind of fear someone would have if they were running from something or someone. He noticed the faint marks on her skin as she adjusted her position. There were bruises, light but visible, on her forearms, and her knees were scuffed with old dirt and blood. Her clothes were worn, too big for her thin frame, and they hung on her as though they had been borrowed from someone else. A chill crept through Thomas as he realized that the girl wasn't just alone in the park by accident. She wasn't here just for fun. She had been hiding something. Something dark. "Who are you running from?" Thomas whispered, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. His military instincts told him that she wasn't a random lost child. Something had driven her to act out of desperation, something that had forced her to cry for help in the only way she knew. The girl's lips quivered again, but no words came out. Her gaze shifted briefly to the side, toward the park exit, and then back to Thomas. There was a fleeting look of panic in her eyes. She was trying to tell him something, but the weight of the fear inside her was too much to put into words. Then, in a sudden motion, she quickly wiped away the tear streaking down her face and stood up, taking a step back. Her hands were now at her sides, clenched into fists. For a moment, Thomas thought she was going to run. He wasn't sure if she would bolt or if she would break down in front of him. But before he could react, the sound of a car engine revved in the distance, pulling into the parking lot near the park. The girl stiffened at the sound. Thomas turned his head quickly, his military training kicking in once again. He scanned the area. The car wasn't one of the usual parkgoers' vehicles. It was a rusty sedan, its paint chipped and faded, and it stopped too abruptly near the entrance. The door swung open, and a figure stepped out. A man. Thomas's pulse quickened as he caught a glimpse of the man's rough, unshaven face and the way his eyes scanned the park, not in the direction of the children, but straight toward the girl. The man's presence was unmistakable. He was searching for her. The girl's body stiffened once more. Her eyes widened, and without a moment's hesitation, she looked up at Thomas, her face a mixture of pleading and terror. She wasn't just trying to escape. She was trying to survive. And it was clear now, she wasn't alone in this fight. Thomas stood up slowly, his mind racing. This wasn't just a child who needed guidance. This was someone in immediate danger. The girl's silent plea for help was more than just a call. It was a warning. He turned back to the girl, his hand reaching for his phone in his pocket. "Stay close," he said quietly. "I'll make sure you're safe." The battle was just beginning, and Thomas knew he couldn't waste a moment. He needed to act fast. The hidden truth. Thomas didn't wait to see if the girl would respond. His instincts were in overdrive now. He could feel the shift in the air, a heaviness that signaled something was wrong. The man who had arrived in the rusty sedan. He wasn't just a passerby. Thomas could tell that by the way he was scanning the park, his gaze sharp and calculating. He wasn't looking for a lost child. He was looking for her. Without a word, Thomas stepped forward, positioning himself between the girl and the man. His heart raced as his hands instinctively moved to his pockets, where his phone sat. He had called the police earlier, but there was no guarantee they would arrive in time. He needed to keep the girl safe, and the last thing he wanted was for the man to catch her alone again. The girl's face twisted with panic. Her body language screamed that she was on the verge of flight. Her hands trembled as she looked from Thomas to the man approaching. In that moment, she seemed so small, so fragile, as if the weight of the world were pressing down on her tiny shoulders. The terror in her eyes was unmistakable, and it tore at Thomas's heart. She was so young, and yet she carried the burden of someone much older, someone who had been through things no child should ever have to endure. "Stay here," Thomas whispered, crouching down so he was on eye level with her. He placed his hands gently on her shoulders, feeling the tension radiating from her. He wasn't sure if she even understood the full extent of what was happening, but he knew that if she ran, it would be worse. Her best chance right now was to stay hidden. The girl nodded slightly, though the fear in her expression never wavered. She didn't trust him fully, and Thomas didn't blame her. Trust was a rare commodity in situations like this, especially for someone who had likely been hurt and betrayed by those she should have been able to trust. But he would do everything in his power to show her that she could trust him. He turned his attention back to the man who was now walking toward them, his strides purposeful and determined. Thomas stood tall, his posture solid and unwavering, ready for whatever the man might do. He had seen too many situations like this before. Abusive figures who hunted their prey like predators, willing to go to any lengths to maintain control. But Thomas wasn't going to let that happen here. Not on his watch. The man stopped a few paces away, eyeing Thomas with a mix of suspicion and disdain. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and eyes that gleamed with a cold, calculating malice. His jacket was unzipped, revealing a stained t-shirt underneath. Thomas immediately noticed the small bulge in the man's pocket, likely a weapon. It wasn't unusual for people like him to carry something to assert dominance. "Is there a problem, old man?" the man asked, his voice rough and low. He didn't sound like he wanted to talk. He sounded like he was used to intimidation. "You got a problem with me being here?" Thomas kept his voice calm, steady. "I'm just making sure the kids in this park are safe," he said, never breaking eye contact with the man. "Seems like you're looking for someone." The man's eyes narrowed at the mention of someone, and Thomas noticed his hand twitch slightly toward his pocket. It was a subtle gesture, but it didn't escape Thomas's trained eye. The girl, now standing behind Thomas, pressed herself against his back as if seeking some kind of shield, her fingers digging into his jacket. She was trembling harder now, and Thomas could feel the weight of her fear. It was suffocating. "I'm not looking for anyone," the man growled, his voice suddenly harder, more menacing. "You don't need to get involved. Just move along, old man, and mind your business." Thomas didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid of this man. He had faced down enemies far more dangerous in his life. But this wasn't the battlefield. This wasn't a war where survival was just about fighting. This was about protecting an innocent life, about making sure a child who had already endured too much didn't fall back into the hands of the monster who had tormented her. "I'm not going anywhere," Thomas said firmly, his eyes never leaving the man's. "And neither is she." The tension between them thickened, an invisible thread of confrontation that could snap at any moment. For a long moment, they stood in a silent standoff. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faintest whisper of leaves in the cool evening air. The only sounds that broke the silence were the distant voices of children and the rhythmic sound of Thomas's breathing. "You think you can stop me?" the man sneered, taking a step forward. "She's mine. You don't know anything about her. Stay out of it." The girl flinched at the man's words, her whole body shrinking in on itself as if his voice was a physical blow. Thomas's gut twisted. He had seen this before. The possessiveness, the control, the abuse of power. It wasn't just about fear. It was about someone who had claimed ownership of another person, someone who thought they had the right to break a child's spirit just to maintain their dominance. "You're not her protector," the man spat, taking another step forward, this time with more force. "You don't know what you're dealing with. Now, get out of the way." Thomas's instincts screamed at him to act. He wasn't going to back down. Not now, not when there was a life on the line. In that split second, he knew that the man's threats were empty, that he wasn't willing to go as far as he claimed. But that didn't mean Thomas could afford to take any chances. He couldn't let this escalate further without making sure the girl was safe. "I've seen enough," Thomas said, his voice low but intense. He stood tall, taking a step toward the man, his posture defensive. He wasn't trying to provoke the man. He was trying to protect the girl, and in that moment, that was the only thing that mattered. "I'm calling the cops. And when they get here, you'll wish you hadn't come looking for trouble." The man's eyes flickered with uncertainty for the briefest moment. But then, in a flash, he made his move. His hand shot toward his pocket, his fingers brushing the outline of the weapon he carried. Thomas was already in motion, his body reacting faster than the man could act. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it with practiced precision, pushing it away from his body. The man yelped in pain as Thomas wrenched his arm behind his back, forcing him to the ground with a practiced move. In one swift motion, Thomas pressed the man's face into the grass, his knee on his back, immobilizing him. The fight was over before it even began. The man was pinned beneath Thomas's weight, struggling and cursing, but there was no escape. The situation had shifted. Now it was Thomas who held the power. "You made a mistake," Thomas growled, his breath coming fast. He wasn't angry. He was focused, calm, his military training kicking in to keep him steady in this high-stress moment. "You think you own her. You don't." The girl stood behind him, her breathing shaky but more composed than before. She was safe. That's all that mattered. In the distance, sirens began to wail, growing louder by the second. The cavalry was finally on its way. The police would handle the rest, and the man's reign of terror would be over. But Thomas wasn't going to move until he knew the girl was in good hands. His grip on the man remained firm as the police arrived, rushing toward the scene. Officers swarmed the area, quickly taking control of the situation. One of the officers approached Thomas, recognizing the veteran's steely gaze and the situation unfolding in front of him. "You did good, sir," the officer said, nodding toward the man who was now being cuffed and dragged toward the squad car. Thomas exhaled a long breath, his hand still shaking slightly. The fight was over, but the real work was just beginning. As the girl was led to the police car, Thomas couldn't help but feel a deep sense of resolve. The nightmare wasn't over for her, not by a long shot. But now, she had a chance, and that was worth everything. A call for justice. The days that followed the confrontation in the park felt like an unyielding blur to Thomas. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm in a crisis, but the events of that evening had left their mark on him. His thoughts constantly returned to the girl, the terror in her eyes, the desperate need for help she had sent out with the simple gestures of her hands. She had asked for rescue, and he had answered. But now, the weight of responsibility weighed heavily on him. The man, Eric, had been arrested and taken into custody, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that the worst wasn't over for the girl. She had been taken to a shelter for children, a safe place where she could rest and begin to recover from the abuse she had endured for so long. But there were still so many unanswered questions. Who was she really? Why had she been left to fend for herself in a situation that no child should ever have to face? What kind of life had she been living, and how had it led her to this moment? The police had been tight-lipped about the case, as they often were with minors, but Thomas had made it his mission to find out everything he could. He knew that the road ahead for the girl would be long, filled with obstacles, pain, and the kind of trauma that could break a person if they weren't careful. But he also knew that with the right help, she could survive it. More than that, she could thrive. Over the next few days, Thomas made several calls to the local children's shelter where the girl had been placed. He had spoken to social workers, counselors, and even a few local officials, trying to gather any information he could about the girl's situation. But every time, he was met with polite refusals and reassurances that the girl was in good hands. There was a constant refrain: "She's going to be okay. We're doing everything we can for her." But Thomas wasn't satisfied. He couldn't just walk away from this. He had to know more. He had to make sure that this wasn't just another case that would fade into the background, another child who would slip through the cracks of the system. He was determined to help Zora. He finally learned her name, and to be part of her journey toward healing. As a veteran, Thomas understood the toll that trauma took on a person. He had witnessed it firsthand, both on the battlefield and in the faces of the soldiers he had served with. There was no easy way to erase the scars that ran deep inside, but there was always a way forward. That was what kept him going every day. The belief that no matter how dark the past had been, the future could still be bright. Late one afternoon, Thomas received a call from a social worker named Maria who worked at the shelter where Zora was staying. Her voice was warm, but there was a hint of sadness behind her words. "Mr. Harris," she began, "I know you've been asking about Zora, and I wanted to speak to you about her. I think she might need someone like you in her life." Thomas's heart gave a small, hopeful leap. This was the break he had been waiting for. "She's a tough kid," Maria continued, "but as you can imagine, the trauma she's been through has left deep marks. She's very withdrawn. She doesn't trust easily, and she's not talking much, except when she writes. She's been keeping a journal." Thomas felt a tight knot in his chest. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed only made the weight of the situation feel heavier. Zora had been through things that no child should ever have to experience, things that left her closed off and isolated from the world. Writing in a journal, though, was a small sign of hope. It meant that she hadn't completely given up on communication, that she still had the desire to express herself, even if it was through words instead of speaking. "I'd like to meet with her," Thomas said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "I know she's been through a lot, but I think I can help. I just need to be there for her." Maria was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice held a note of caution. "It's not going to be easy, Mr. Harris. Zora has been through a lot. She's terrified of being abandoned again. But maybe someone who's shown such concern for her could help. If you're willing to take that step, we can set up a meeting." Thomas didn't hesitate. "I'm ready, whatever it takes." They arranged to meet at the shelter the following afternoon. Thomas barely slept that night, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew that Zora needed someone stable, someone who could provide not just protection, but consistency. She had already suffered far too much loss in her young life, and he was determined that she wouldn't lose hope. The next day, he arrived at the shelter early. As he entered, Maria greeted him with a warm smile, but with an undercurrent of concern in her eyes. She led him to a small, quiet room, where Zora was sitting at a table, her back to the door. The girl had her journal in front of her, her pen moving across the pages, though she didn't seem to be writing much. She was lost in her thoughts, her shoulders hunched, and her hair fell in tangled curls around her face. Maria paused in the doorway and glanced at Thomas. "She's a little apprehensive about meeting new people," she said quietly. "But she's been talking more with us since we got her settled here. Just don't push her too much. Let her come to you in her own time." Thomas nodded, his heart aching for the girl. He could tell she was trying to block out the world, but he also saw something else in her posture, a small flicker of hope, just a glimmer. She wasn't beyond saving, not by a long shot. He stepped into the room slowly, making sure not to startle her. Zora didn't look up immediately, but Thomas could see her fingers tighten around the pen in her hand, as if she were trying to hold on to something tangible in a world that felt far too chaotic. He cleared his throat gently, trying to make his presence known without alarming her. "Hi, Zora," he said softly, keeping his voice low and calm. "My name's Thomas. I'm the one who helped you in the park the other day." At the mention of the park, Zora's head snapped up, and her eyes locked onto his. She didn't speak, but her expression was intense, full of a mixture of fear and recognition. The recognition made his chest tighten. She remembered him. She remembered that he had been there when she needed someone. And that, in itself, was a breakthrough. "I know things have been tough for you," Thomas continued, sitting down at a chair across from her. But I want you to know that you don't have to go through this alone. You've got people who care now." Zora's gaze softened just a fraction, but she didn't say anything. She placed the pen down gently and closed her journal, as if weighing whether or not she should engage. Thomas sat still, not pushing, not rushing her. He knew that trust wasn't something that could be built in a day, especially after the kind of trauma she had been through. But he could see that her walls weren't as high as they had been before. There was something in her eyes, some small spark of hope. She wasn't completely closed off. "Would you like to talk?" he asked gently. "Or maybe you just want to sit here for a while." Zora stared at him, her gaze flickering between his eyes and the journal in her lap. She hesitated, but then, slowly, she reached for the journal again. She opened it, flipped to a page near the back, and scribbled something down. Then, without looking up, she slid the journal across the table toward him. Thomas looked down at the page. It was a short sentence, written in her small, neat handwriting. "Can I trust you?" Thomas's heart swelled with compassion. He knew this was the beginning, the first step toward healing. It was small, but it was everything. "I'm here for you," he replied quietly. "For as long as you need." Zora didn't speak, but she nodded slowly, her fingers curling around the edge of the journal once more. For the first time since he had met her, Thomas saw a flicker of something resembling hope in her eyes. This was just the beginning, a path forward. The weeks following Thomas's first meeting with Zora felt like a quiet but significant shift in both their lives. While Zora was still hesitant, still grappling with the complex emotions that surrounded her past, something had changed between them. The walls she had built around herself, while not yet gone, were showing cracks. And Thomas, though patient and understanding, couldn't help but feel that he was making progress, however small, toward helping her heal. Every time he returned to the shelter to visit her, there was a subtle change. She would smile more, make fleeting eye contact, and sometimes, just sometimes, speak in a quiet, almost unsure voice. It was enough to fill Thomas with hope that she could move forward from the horrors of her past. But it wasn't easy. Zora was still a child trapped in a world she couldn't yet fully understand. Her trauma wasn't something that could be fixed by just offering comfort or reassurance. It would take time, patience, and a level of emotional support that Thomas hadn't anticipated needing to give. But he was willing to go the distance. He had made a promise to himself that he wouldn't leave her behind, no matter how difficult the journey was. One afternoon, as the sun cast a golden hue over the shelter's garden, Thomas sat in the small visitor's room waiting for Zora. The social workers had informed him that she had made progress in therapy, and they hoped she would be more open to talking. Her journal, which had once been her solitary outlet for expression, was now being used less frequently, though Zora had still kept it close to her side. It was as if she was inching forward, piece by piece, shedding the layers of fear and loss that had once defined her world. Maria, the social worker who had been his point of contact throughout this process, entered the room with a soft smile. "She's been asking about you," she said, her voice light, but tinged with concern. "She doesn't always show it, but I think she's beginning to trust you." Thomas nodded. "I'm not in any rush. She needs to do this at her pace. I'm here for her, whatever that looks like." Maria's gaze softened as she sat across from him. "You know, Thomas, not everyone would do this. Many people in your position would have walked away by now. But you're really making a difference for her. She's starting to let her guard down." Thomas looked out the window, his eyes scanning the brightening sky. The evening was drawing close, and the park outside was peaceful. It was hard to imagine that just a few weeks ago, Zora had been desperate and afraid. That thought weighed heavily on his heart. How could someone so young have endured so much? How could anyone, let alone a child, be pushed to the brink of hopelessness by those meant to care for them? But Zora had survived. She had fought for her life, even if she didn't yet know how to fight for herself. And now Thomas was determined to make sure she knew that she wasn't alone. Just as he was about to speak, the door opened gently, and there she stood, Zora. Her hair was messier than usual, curls spilling out of the clip she had hastily used to tie it back. Her clothes were simple, worn jeans and a loose t-shirt, but there was something different in the way she carried herself now. It was subtle, but it was there, a hint of strength behind the uncertainty in her eyes. She was still shy, still unsure, but there was something in her posture that suggested a small step forward. "Hi, Zora," Thomas said softly, standing to greet her. He wasn't sure what to expect today. Sometimes she'd be more talkative, other times quieter. But no matter what, he always made sure to meet her at her pace. Zora glanced up at him, her eyes quickly darting away. She stepped inside, her feet hesitant on the floor as if she were testing the ground beneath her. Without a word, she sat down across from him, but she didn't say anything. The silence stretched between them, thick with the unspoken tension of her past and her reluctance to reveal too much too soon. Maria gave a slight nod and quietly left the room, giving them space to talk. The door closed with a soft click behind her, leaving Thomas and Zora alone in the room. Thomas took a slow breath, his voice gentle. "You know, I've been thinking about how much you've been through. I can't pretend to know what it's like, but I know this much. You're not alone anymore. I'll always be here if you need someone to talk to." Zora hesitated, her fingers playing with the edge of her sleeve. Thomas noticed how her eyes flickered between the table and his face, her uncertainty a silent barrier she was still working to lower. He gave her time, not pressing her to speak, just being present. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke in a soft voice, almost too quiet for him to hear. "Why are you still here?" Her question was simple, but there was an underlying depth to it. An uncertainty about why someone would continue to care when it seemed so easy to walk away. Thomas felt his chest tighten. He understood the root of her question, the doubt she harbored. After all she had been through, it made sense that she might question why anyone would stick around for the long haul. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes meeting hers with a warmth that he hoped would reach her. "Because I promised you I would be," Thomas said, his voice steady. "And I'm not going anywhere, Zora. You don't have to carry this by yourself anymore." Zora looked at him for a long moment, her gaze intense, but filled with something new, an openness, a curiosity, even if just for a moment. Her lips parted, and this time, she spoke with more conviction, though still softly. "Do you think I'll ever be okay?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Thomas's heart ached for her. It was a question that so many children in her situation must ask themselves, and it was one that often went unanswered. But for Zora, he knew that the answer was important. She needed to hear it from someone she could trust. "I think you will be," he said simply. "It's going to take time. It won't be easy, and there'll be days when it feels like you're taking a step back. But you're strong, Zora. You've made it this far, and that says something about who you are. You just need to keep going, and I'll be right here, helping you take that next step." Zora didn't say anything for a long moment. She looked down at her hands, fiddling with the corner of the table. But Thomas noticed the smallest flicker of a change in her demeanor, a slight softening of the tension in her shoulders, the faintest spark of something akin to hope in her eyes. Finally, she nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if to herself. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a sign that she was willing to trust him, even just a little bit more. Thomas smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. It wasn't much, but it was everything. The road ahead would be long, filled with bumps and setbacks, but in this moment, he felt like they were on the right path. Over the following weeks, Zora began to open up more, slowly but surely. She was still guarded, still unsure of herself and the world around her, but with every visit, every quiet conversation, she began to rebuild. The journal, once her only means of expressing her thoughts, was now shared with Thomas at times. She would write in it during their sessions together, and slowly, she started to share parts of herself through the pages. Thomas was there for each step, a constant presence in her journey. He never pushed too hard, never forced her to speak more than she was ready to. He simply allowed her the space to heal, knowing that in time she would find her voice again. And with each passing day, Zora became stronger, more resilient. The bond between them deepened, and she began to realize that she didn't have to hide anymore. She didn't have to carry the weight of her past alone. There was a future ahead of her, one filled with hope and possibility, and Thomas would be there every step of the way. The road was long, but it was no longer a road Zora had to walk alone. And that was enough for now. Healing and growth. As the weeks turned into months, the quiet rhythm of Zora's healing began to establish itself. The process was never straightforward. There were setbacks, moments where she retreated into herself, days when she couldn't speak, couldn't write, couldn't even look at Thomas without the weight of her past threatening to swallow her. But then there were the days when she laughed. A soft, hesitant sound that seemed to come from deep within her, a laugh that was more a tentative reclaiming of joy than an expression of mirth. It was on one of those days, in late spring, that Thomas noticed the most significant shift. Zora had started attending therapy regularly, as had been recommended by the shelter. She was learning tools to deal with her trauma, ways to cope when the memories became too much, ways to express herself when the silence felt unbearable. But it wasn't just therapy that was changing her. It was the consistency, the trust she had begun to build with Thomas, the slowly building realization that maybe, just maybe, she could be free of the chains her past had bound her with. On one particular morning, the sunlight spilled into the small room where Zora and Thomas met. The room was quiet, save for the sound of Zora's pen scratching on paper. She was writing again, though not in the way she had in the past, furiously pouring her grief onto the pages, trying to make sense of a world that had abandoned her. No, today she was writing something different. She was writing slowly, carefully, with a sense of purpose. Thomas watched her from across the table. She still had the habit of avoiding eye contact when she was writing or thinking, but her body language had changed. There was less tension in her posture, fewer signs of that unrelenting weight that seemed to carry her through the days, like a cloak of sorrow. She wasn't fully healed, not by any means, but the shift was undeniable. She was moving forward. He smiled to himself, a small, quiet smile that came from a place of hope. He had seen so many veterans over the years, so many people who had faced impossible odds. They'd all come back from battle, but many of them had come back broken, physically, mentally, emotionally. And yet there was always a part of him that believed in the power of resilience. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it, to make it a part of you without allowing it to control you. "Do you mind if I take a look?" Thomas asked, his voice low and non-threatening. He didn't want to interrupt her process, but Zora had started to trust him enough to share her thoughts more freely. And in the months since their first meeting, she had let him into the depths of her world in a way that was still difficult for her, but far more open than she had been in the beginning. Zora glanced up from her paper. Her eyes, still haunted by the memories of her past, softened when they met his. She didn't say anything, but she slid the journal across the table, her fingers lingering on it for just a moment longer than necessary. A subtle invitation. Thomas picked it up gently, turning the pages with care, as though he were handling something fragile. As he read, he found something different in her writing. She wasn't writing just about the horrors she had endured, though those were still present in the undercurrents of her words. What caught his eye were the small moments of light that had started to slip into her pages. Glimmers of hope, small moments of kindness from people who weren't like the ones who had hurt her. One passage made his heart swell with pride. "I used to think I was alone, but now I know that people can care. Mr. Thomas doesn't ask for anything in return. He just listens." Thomas paused for a moment, his breath catching in his chest. Zora wasn't just surviving anymore. She was beginning to heal. Her words were a small but powerful testament to the bond they had built, to the trust they had nurtured in the quiet moments they shared. This wasn't just a friendship. It was a partnership, a healing journey that they were walking together. "I'm glad you're letting me in," Thomas said softly, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at her, meeting her gaze for the first time in what felt like an eternity. She had changed, and so had he. This wasn't about rescuing a child from a monster anymore. It was about walking alongside her as she found her own strength, her own voice. Zora didn't respond immediately. She just sat there, her fingers curling around the journal, but for the first time, there was no fear in her movements. No hesitation. She was learning to let people in. Slowly, carefully, but surely. "I want to be better," she said quietly, almost as if the words surprised her. "I want to learn how to be happy again." Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. There it was, the heart of it. The simple but profound truth. It wasn't just about escaping the past. It was about learning to live again, about finding joy even after everything had been lost. "You already are better," Thomas replied, his voice steady, though it trembled slightly with emotion. "You're here. You're fighting. That's all anyone can ask for." Zora didn't say anything else, but the smile that flickered on her face was enough. It was small, almost shy, but it was there. And for Thomas, it was everything. The next few weeks saw more shifts in Zora's behavior. Her visits to therapy had become less of a forced activity and more of a genuine effort to understand and process her emotions. She started participating more in group activities at the shelter, interacting with the other kids and even beginning to make friends. There were still moments of intense withdrawal, when the weight of her trauma would pull her back into the darkness. But those moments became fewer and farther between. The real test came when Zora was informed that Eric, her abusive stepfather, was in the process of facing charges for the things he had done to her. The legal system was slow, and the trial would take months to unfold, but it was a critical moment for Zora. It was the first time in her life that she had the power to confront the person who had hurt her, to face the past that had held her prisoner for so long. When Thomas heard about it, he knew this moment would be difficult for her. He had seen it before, the way survivors of abuse sometimes relived their pain when confronted with the prospect of justice. It wasn't just about the court case, it was about everything it represented. A chance to face the past, a chance to let go of the fear, a chance to finally reclaim some control over her life. Zora didn't want to go to the court hearings, not at first. She was terrified of seeing Eric again, of being in the same room as the man who had shaped so much of her suffering. But she also knew, deep down, that it was a necessary part of her healing. And so, after much discussion with her therapists and with Thomas, she agreed to attend the proceedings, though she insisted that Thomas be there with her. The day of the trial was an overwhelming one. Zora was anxious, shaking with nerves as she sat beside Thomas in the courtroom. She had never been in a place like this before, surrounded by strangers and formalities, the cold, impersonal atmosphere pressing in on her. But Thomas sat beside her, a quiet anchor in the storm. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He just kept his presence steady, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. When it came time for her to testify, Thomas watched with pride as she stood before the court. Zora was nervous, yes, but she was also incredibly brave. She spoke about the things Eric had done to her, not in a way that sought revenge, but in a way that sought to reclaim her voice, to share her truth with the world. She was shaking as she spoke, her words coming out in fits and starts, but she got through it. When she finished, Thomas saw a shift in her eyes, a quiet, unspoken strength that hadn't been there before. She had taken back a piece of herself, a piece that had been stolen from her for so long. And in that moment, he knew that Zora was no longer just surviving. She was starting to heal. By the time the trial was over, Eric had been found guilty. He was sentenced to a long time in prison. But for Zora, the victory wasn't in the legal outcome. It was in what she had done for herself. She had stood up, faced her abuser, and spoken her truth. She had started the process of reclaiming her life, piece by piece. And Thomas was there, every step of the way, watching as she grew stronger. In the months that followed, Zora continued to make progress. She was no longer a girl trapped by her past. She was a young woman finding her way in the world, one step at a time. There were still tough days ahead, still moments when the weight of her trauma would come crashing down on her. But Thomas knew something now that he hadn't understood before. Healing wasn't a destination. It was a journey. And Zora was walking it with courage, with strength, and with a heart that was slowly learning to trust again. And for the first time in a long time, Thomas allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay.